And a very good evening to you, and welcome to Politics 101. Tuesday evening. We had a program last night because tomorrow, Wednesday, and on Thursday, I wouldn't be on. So we had a program last evening, unusual for us because our nights are Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. So we a little bit off this week because I have two conflicting events that I must attend to tomorrow and on Thursday. So we were on last evening, we're on today, and I think we will make up on Friday evening. So welcome to Politics 101. If you're joining us from Guyana, welcome. You're joining us from the wider Caribbean, welcome to Politics 101. As I was leaving class this evening, I one of my colleagues who was using the classroom that I was vacating came in, and we um, exchanged greetings. And he's from Mexico, teaching transborder studies. And then I he asked me where I was from. I said Guyana. He said, the new oil-rich country. You have more oil than Mexico. I said, what? Previously when you tell people you're from Guyana, if they're of a certain age group, they remember Jonestown, or they say British Guyana. Now, people of all ages are saying, the oil-rich country. Quite apt for our program this evening. Already on the screen, Mr. Elson Low, who is our guest this evening. We're going to be talking economics, and we're going to be shooting off proverbially, not literally, but figuratively. We are going to be taking off from that recent report by the World Bank. Well, it's not a report, but it's an updating of Guyana's economic profile by the World Bank, in which we saw the startling news there that on the one hand, Guyana's growth, certainly its growth numerically, has really risen, thanks, of course, to oil and gas. We know that the other areas of the economy have not been doing as well as one thought they would do. So our growth rate, the GDP, the rise in the GDP, all of that is attributed in a big way to oil, and of course, the other piece of information on the other hand. So we Chinese and Caribbean people, we say on the one hand, we have all this growth, and on the other hand, we seem to have had a rise in poverty. I think our poverty rate, and Elson is going to give us the direct, because I think our poverty rate was around 1.5 US dollars, something like that today. But because of the revenues that are coming in, they have now adjusted it to 5.5 US dollars, which is $1,100. That is the poverty line. And they're saying 48% of Guyanese, I assume, workers. But again, the economists will correct me there. But 48% of our people are living below that $1,100. So they're living, in effect, below the poverty line. Now, those of us who teach abroad, we usually rail because in the United States, about 30% of its citizens are living below the poverty line. And that's the poverty line that the United States government set. But here we are in oil-rich Guyana, 48%. On the one hand, big growth, I think 20% GDP growth last year, 2021. And then we have this 48% that's living below the poverty line. What's going on there from an economic standpoint? And that's what our guest tonight, Mr. Elson Low, who is no stranger to this program, who is no stranger to the public discourse in Guyana, young man, very bright. And, those of us at my age don't use that word lightly. I remember when I was young, when the older men and women said, "By you's a bright boy," you push out your chest because you. Now I am an old man. I find myself using the word bright very sparingly, but it's no secret that I'm a big fan, a big admirer of this young man who I think has a good head on his shoulders, as they will say. And I'm old now. So I think, Mr. Low, welcome again to Politics 101.
Always good to be on. Thank you very much for having me tonight. A topic that is at once, I think, fascinating, but also a little depressing to hear these kinds of poverty statistics. And
Yeah,
I'll give viewers an understanding that it's actually gotten quite a bit worse from the time that the statistics were actually gathered. So it
wow.
is definitely a concerning situation. But I think perhaps for the man on the ground, not particularly surprising. And what will I also like to give you viewers some perspective on is that because we've not seen some of the structural changes that are really required to fight this type of poverty, unfortunately, I think that it's going to persist, and really, you're going to see very high levels of inequality in the economy. So that is, like I said, fascinating, but also quite unfortunate. Quite unfortunate.
Yes, as I was driving home just now from campus and listening to the radio on the elections here, and I heard one of the analysts said that, look, I mean, it's one thing you may get away saying, look, the economic situation in America, which is as dread as it is in Guyana, has to do with the Democrats. But it's a harder thing to make the argument that this is not all our doing, meaning the Democrats making the argument, this is not all our doing, it's the world economic situation which we have little control over. And it made me think, because I've heard that argument in relation to Guyana from PPP supporters, that look, the dread economic situation has to do with the war and what's happening in the global political economy. But I dare say, even from my layman standpoint, poverty is not something that started yesterday. Come in Guyana, that started the war. Go ahead.
You're quite right there, but the other thing I would say, and I wouldn't call anyone lazy, but the argument I find to be a little bit lazy because it is important really to recognize that in all these other countries that are also facing high inflation, they are not growing at nearly 60% this year. In what with Guyana being the fastest growing country, few countries in the history of mankind have grown at 60% per year, and they have not been receiving huge revenues, massive amounts of revenue from the oil and gas industry because of the high oil price. And so for them to say, oh, these woes that are international, I think really is almost as if they don't live in Guyana, they don't have a perspective on Guyana, they're not aware of what's going on. Because we are one of the few countries that is very well positioned to benefit and to do well and to make life easy for our citizens during this time period. And in fact, the country is expected to make, by the end of the year, we'll know the final total, around about 300 million US more than we had expected at the beginning of the year because of the on really the very high oil price. The Bank of Guyana report has detailed that, expecting that about a third more revenue than we really thought would happen would come through, and so as a result, by the end of the year, it will add up to around about 300 million US of just unexpected extra funds. Now that works out to about $300,000 per household, which we've mentioned in our press conference that that money needs to find its way to the people because it is the furthest thing.
Repeat that number. Repeat that number for me.
That works out to around about 300,000 Guyana dollars per household.
300,000 Guyana dollars per household.
And that's
And
just the extra.
this is just the extra income.
Mhm. Exactly.
Continue to talk to us, young man.
Well, in only 3 months of the year, the third quarter, Guyana made, I think, 493 million US of revenue just from the oil sector, which works out roughly to about about 500,000 per household over that 3 month period. Every 100 million is about 100,000 per household, if you use that as your rule of thumb. And so, what has essentially happened is the country's made lots and lots of money. But in the course of making all of that money, it has made a windfall from the high oil price due to the unexpected conflict in Ukraine. So, on the one hand, you have high prices due to the unexpected conflict in Ukraine and the inflation that's caused, especially regarding food. And on the other hand, you've got the country making a huge amount of excess revenue from the high oil price. Now, the government has taken a deliberate choice not to redistribute that revenue. There are many ways to do it: $300,000, which can be broken out over a period of months to cool off any inflationary concerns. $300,000 per household, rather. That is something that can be done. That's one thing that we have recommended. But over the course of the year, some of your viewers may recall that we called for them to bring down the price of gasoline, because that is one of the core factors that's creating an inflationary environment. The cost of transportation and the cost of just bringing your grains from your farm to the market. If it costs twice as much in terms of gas price, and obviously that's going to feed through to the price of grains. The government said, oh, nothing can be done. They've already cut the excise tax. They can't bring down the gas price. And then about 2 months after that, they brought down the gas price at Guy Oil. So, they capitulated in that regard, and they recognized that we had really the right idea about how to approach that particular problem. But we've also said that they need to go further than that and give vouchers and so on to minibus drivers, to canter operators who bring in greens to the market, to deal with the food inflation problem, to bring down the price of food. And the reason that and this is going to tie now back to your poverty statistics, the reason that we've got such a focus on food is that studies have shown in the US, in South Africa, in various parts of the world, that the poor spend, the people on the lower end of the income scale, spend a higher proportion of their budget on food. They don't have a whole lot of extra money for luxuries and so on. So a high proportion of their budget is spent on food. What that means is that when you've got high food prices, the poor, therefore, are disproportionately affected by the high food prices relative to other segments of the economy. So your well-off people will not be as affected by high food prices because they're not spending as big of a proportion. But the people who will be most affected are the poor. And so that now has really accelerated the poverty problem in the country. Because what you've got is, we started off with a base from 2019 of 48% poverty. But if you've seen prices go up for the things that poor people depend the most on, namely food, and if you look at the level of food inflation from the time PPP got into office to now, you're talking about almost 25% increase in food prices. That has meant that the purchasing power of poor people, their actual ability to get by, has fallen very, very substantially. And that really, therefore, means that it is not 48% poverty, as the World Bank is indicating, but that it should be much worse than that, because of the nature of the current circumstances. Obviously, if the government either lowered the price of food and so on through reducing the price of gasoline, as we have indicated, as I explained, that would go a long way towards alleviating the situation. But also, put simply, if they were to give the 300,000 excess revenue out, even if it is broken up over the course of a couple of months, that would similarly help poor people to make it through these difficult times. But the government has chosen not to do that. If you look at the supplemental budget they passed, which was $44 billion, so massive supplemental budget, that had almost nothing in it for cost of living relief, almost nothing in it.
Mm-hmm.
So they had an opportunity. They had an opportunity to do something about it. That supplemental budget was passed after the war in Ukraine. They were able to observe all of these high prices, see how difficult it was for people, see that we're making excess revenue, and they decided not to help. And so that is why the situation is so desperate, with people complaining nonstop about the price of things in the market, goods in the market, and overall how difficult it is to get by in Guyana.
Yeah. Elson, there is such a thing as you have argued on this program and other places before. There is such a thing as an economic vision. Where do you want to take this country? This is a post-colonial society. Our early economists grappled with the condition of post-plantation. How do you enter an international market as a monoculture economy, meaning an economy that produces one major product? How do you how do you enter a world economy that was not made for you? Because the end of the Second World War, as you know, the Bretton Woods agreement did not cater for a country like Guyana because Guyana wasn't a country, right? And so in 1966, 1962, in case of Jamaica and Trinidad, we are entering this world that wasn't made for us. And so our economists had to grapple with the whole notion of post-plantationhood. We have now transitioned from a post-plantation society, monoculture economy, to an oil economy, it then calls for a thinking through, as our early economists were challenged to do, to think through our condition, to look at the world around us and ask, where do we want to take Guyana economically? Given our own peculiarities, given the world in which we live in, and given our own access to resources, one would think that our economists, including those and especially those that are supporting the government or are in government, to really think this thing through. What is your vision for Guyana? And when I listen to you and other economists, I am hearing a paucity. Some would argue an absence of economic vision. So when you tell me that you got 300, what's the number, 300,000?
300,000 per household.
Per household in excess.
Excellent.
In excess, and you're telling me that money is coming through, that in spite of the war where other people are suffering, we are actually benefiting from the war, and yet you have 48% poverty. Then you are telling me, first of all, there's no economic vision, and secondly, I am asking where all that money is going. If it's not going to alleviate poverty, which is the single most debilitating economic affliction of a country like Guyana. And if you are not tackling that, what is your economic vision? And what are your economic priorities? Help me.
Well, one of the things you don't have to look far to see really what the government is doing, because they've said it themselves. Earlier in the year, they listed their economic priorities, which was health, education, diversifying the economy, and so on. But they did not list fighting poverty or dealing with inequality. And to my mind, that means that they have no sense of what is going on. Now, what is key is that it seems to me that the PPP is running Guyana as if it is the same country with the same economy that it had under the 23 years, just more revenue. They have not a sense whatsoever of the real challenges brought about that are specific to oil. And one of the first things, that I mentioned to the leader of the opposition when we in these conversations, is that the capital challenge that you face as an oil producer is that you have an outsized sector with tremendous growth and tremendous revenues, and you have to find a way to redistribute some of those revenues in such that you can deal with great income inequality that will arise, moderate that income inequality, and then moderate the wealth inequality that will follow. And that really, if you have oil which almost is already dominating Guyana's economy, I think it's about 60% of the economy is oil at this stage, and next year it's going to go up again. It's going to be very difficult for the other industries to catch up for some time. So what you've got to do is to have the types of policies that will rebalance things so that people are not left behind. Inequality and fighting poverty, therefore, are first and foremost amongst your concerns because those are the things that are affected the most by the rapid change, rapid change. And so, what we've seen is that you've got parts of the economy that are booming, but the minimum wage, they barely moved it this year, and we had to fight them as in the opposition to get them to move the minimum wage. But that is nowhere near what it really will end up having to be. Of course, you know that we recently mentioned that the average Guyanese needs to be getting around about $150,000 at minimum a month, because when we look at it, in order for you to live in Guyana comfortably and given the resources of the country, that's really the base level that you should be at. But what we've articulated is a series of policies that deal with these questions. One of the core questions is the question of education to help people to get high paying jobs so that they can keep up, their wages can keep up with the growth in the economy, they won't be left behind. Now, we have talked about student stipends. We've talked about night school, so people who didn't pass maths and English to get another chance to pass those exams. We've talked about making the University of Guyana free, as well as writing off all student debts and compensating those who paid in cash who are resident. We've talked about topping up people's salaries to ensure they're not living below that poverty line. We've talked about free electricity and water for people on the lower end of the income scale. The reason we're talking about all of these things is that we recognize that the revenues are concentrated in the government's hands. And we have to find ways to redistribute it so that it, first of all, alleviates poverty, deals with inequality. And second of all, helps to make the economy productive so that long term we will have a diversified economy. It is a real tragedy in Guyana that approximately, give or take, 80% of people in Guyana don't have math and English, don't have both a math and English pass at CSEC. The pass rate for math this year was 34%, and it's been as low as that almost the entire time the PPU was in office for that 23 years. For a long, prolonged period, it was extremely low. We had improved it into the mid 40s, but still there was a long way to go. Now, what that adds up to, though, is that around about 80% of the population doesn't have maths and English. Now, that's not even, we're not even talking about a first degree, which is, a minuscule percentage of a first degree. But we're talking about a basic level of qualification, which, as an example, would allow you to become an assistant, right, at an office job.
Mhm.
Now, in the US, 90% of people have that level of qualification to become an assistant without having a first degree. So we are in the opposite situation. The reason that we are stressing these types of policies like night schools, like stipends for students and so on, is because if we do not address this education gap, we will find ourselves with very serious wage inequality and wealth inequality because people will not have access to high paying jobs. That's the real terrifying thing, I think, because as much as you may have all this growth, if people don't have access to high paying jobs, that's a big problem. Number one. And number two, if you're not going to be redistributing in a way to help people to get access to these high paying jobs and to ease some of the pressures on poverty and inequality, then you're just gonna let those things run wild, and that is really what you've seen in Guyana. Um, Another way to look at it that some of your viewers may appreciate is that we've seen in assets such as stocks, such as housing, and so on, 300%, 400% increases, really massive increases. So people are as much as 5 times as rich as they were only a few years ago. Stock market is up around about 400%. It's stalled for a bit now, but it is up quite substantially. The minimum wage, though, is only up 36%. So the wealthy people in the society are 5 times richer than they were, but minimum wage is barely up. And that to me is an early sign of an extreme degree of inequality growing in the society. An extreme degree of inequality. But I go circle all the way back to when I said that the government has not mentioned as one of their priorities inequality and fighting poverty. They have not mentioned that that's a priority. And so it is no surprise, therefore, that you're seeing this go on in the country and you're seeing no policies to address the particular issues that are coming out of the oil and gas economy. So that to me is what makes the situation quite bleak, right? It is not just that there's a problem; is that there's a total lack of recognition that there is a problem.
You know, in the old days when we would scold economists and governments, people would say they're running the country like a cake shop. But I tell you, I grew up in a village, and I know cake shop well. And I think those cake shop owners did a better job than our governments are doing. And we have always had problems with our governments in Guyana and the region in terms of targeting the areas of the economy that can break us out of the post-colonial days. They've been woeful at that, largely because they run governments to win election rather than to solve the problems. But if the ones before could have made the argument that they were cash strapped, they didn't have revenue, they had to go to the IMF, they had to go to the World Bank, they had to go to the IDB, etc., etc. This government cannot make that same kind of excuse. And so, therefore, one has to indict this government for starving this country, for pushing the country further and further into poverty and enriching, as you explained just now, a small elite. Now, if poor people children don't have math, what that means, there's an whole area of employment that they're cut off from. That is willful on the part of government. That is willful exploitation. That is willful marginalization. Because you are keeping willfully by not targeting an area that keeps them out of certain employment. That's willful underdevelopment. Your comments.
No, I couldn't agree more. It is the furthest thing from acceptable that the vast majority of people could be not passing these exams. And the background to this, which your viewers may be even more concerned by, is you have around about 17,000 people who write common entrance, but only around about 10,000 who write CSEC. So what happened to the 7,000 students? They dropped out of high school. So, in addition to having the majority of people not passing maths, a huge number dropped out before they even got to that stage. That's how you get to this incredibly high 80% number where people do not have math and English. That's really how this thing happens. And you may say, oh, they went to technical schools like TVET and so on, but that's only a couple thousand people. You have, if you look at a 5 year high school experience, you're talking about 35,000 people that have dropped out. Where did these 35,000 people go? So this is, I think that what is really alarming, and the government, if you can believe this, has not said one word about a massive night school program to help people who didn't pass maths go back and write maths. Can you imagine that 80% of the population doesn't have this pass? It is required for you to get an office job, and they're just comfortable leaving it like that. That's the first thing I'd say. The second thing is, you mentioned a cake shop, and I find that quite entertaining. When we had first indicated that gasoline prices need to be brought down, the response the government said is that it's cake shop economics. And then only a few months later, the finance minister is coming out there saying that Guy Oil is going to bring down the price of gas. It is, to my mind, really an indictment of the quality of the policy making that the PUP has got going on. And I'd say another thing. I'm not going to tell them what I would have done under the 23 years if I were there, but it is transparently obvious what should have been done. I don't know why they never did it, but it was very obvious what the country needed to do in order to move forward. They just never took those steps. Perhaps they were too distracted by trying to thief everything that wasn't nailed down to the ground. But it is very obvious what they should have done, and many other countries across the world were doing that. They just, whether it's a lack of imagination, lack of awareness, or distraction. So I don't hold their policymaking in high regard whatsoever. I don't consider it to be particularly good or at all. And for you not to mention inequality and poverty in this circumstance, it's like you're totally disconnected from what is going on, right? It to me it means that they don't even understand how oil economies work, what the challenges are that oil economies face. They have no idea. So as a result, the policies are very much, I think, off. Yes, there needs to be a focus on some infrastructure. Yes, there are things that need to be done, but oil and gas resources tend to get to become squandered if you focus only on
Mm-hmm.
infrastructure, and that's been the experience of many oil and gas economies, especially where corruption is involved. On the other hand, education has been demonstrated to be one of the main ways that countries are able to develop, and so there should be a tremendous focus. Of course, people may say, well, the government, they spent so much more in education. I think they spent about 30 billion more in education this year. But what is interesting, and Guyanese have got to be aware of how these numbers can be used to fool you. So yes, they've spent more on education this year. But do you know that the share of the budget, the proportion of the budget that's spent on education, has fallen from about 16% to about 13%? So it's a bigger budget overall, and they've shrunk the share that's spent on education. Meanwhile, they're going out saying that they expect to spend 20% per annum on education. So they're spending at a deficit of 7% already. And
Yeah.
I would say this is especially alarming because this is the first chance they've gotten to spend oil money. And that is what you're going to do. You're going to cut the share that's spent on education. What are your priorities? I then have to ask. So definitely, I think an early warning sign that Guyanese have to be very, very wary of is that for them not to be putting as much of a focus on education. I don't know where they're going with that kind of thinking, especially in this context where you have a real gap in terms of the number of people who have appropriate qualifications. And so and what I think also concerns me is they're going to look to bring in some labor to fill these jobs.
Yeah.
Now, I would say this. I would say Cherry, Borno, Martin Cartner, Rodney, everybody would be incensed. All of Guyana's historical figures would be incensed by the idea that you're going to leave Guyanese who punished for all these years without the opportunities to get the high paying jobs and import a bunch of foreigners to really to get those jobs. That is totally unacceptable. Yes, if you need, some qualified people, you can bring some in the short term. But it has to be married with an idea that you're going to educate people so that over the medium to long term, they can fill those posts. Ignoring that issue is the height of folly, and I think it is deeply shameful.
Very shameful. Elson Low here tonight walking us through political economy 101, walking us through what's happening in Guyana. These societies, Guyana, the wider Caribbean, African society, these post-colonial society, last wave of post-colonial societies beginning in the 1960s, these are particular type of political economies. These are economies that underwent enslavement and colonialism for close to 250, 300 years. And therefore, there is a particular identity to these economies. It is not that one doesn't have to think through big economies, but those are all the countries. They would have had time to work out what kind of economy, what kind of political system. We in Guyana and the Caribbean are called upon to work out our economics, our politics, our culture, all at the same time. It means, therefore, that we've got to put brains, we have to have imagination, we have to have people who can transcend party politics. You know, I've been a critic in many respects of the Grange administration, but I say one thing I think about, there's some key areas that at least thought was put into it. They might not have had time to put in practice. a lot of the things. But at least you could have seen them grappling with sugar. And this is before we knew that we had oil, right? Grappling with sugar, grappling with what to do with the public service and so on. And that's where I want to take you next. Historically, public servants have been made to suffer under successive post-colonial governments. And it's always the government answer, I mean, I get money. We don't have money. Why are public servants still feeling the squeeze, Elson Low?
Yeah, well, what I would say is really what we must recognize as a country is that the level of responsibility that public servants have now is much more because they're dealing with much higher figures. The simple example of a policeman, yeah, before we had oil, if he doesn't do his duty, yes, it's bad, yes, it's a danger to the society. But now, if he doesn't do his duty, maybe some Exxon workers won't be able to get to the rigs or something, and there'll be a disruption or a slowdown, or he has a lot more responsibility, and so policemen, teachers, even just the regular workers who are processing things, we really are. They have a much greater responsibility now in terms of the monetary value of their contributions, and so of course, I believe that public servants need to get additional, very substantial pay raises, even as much as we work to improve productivity, we work to improve our standards and so on, quality of policing and so on. But we really do need to see some substantial public servant increases because the dangers and the negatives to the economy are much greater now than they were. It is not a situation where the losses are small if public servants don't do their jobs well. The losses can be very substantial because we're dealing with bigger numbers. And so that is why we've got to, first of all, pay our public servants well, and so they're due for, I think, a very substantial increase this year. We've called for at least a 25% increase, at least to keep pace with the food inflation. At the very least, it should be something to that effect. But it is an area that needs the appropriate attention going forward. I think that the government, however, has not expressed, let me put it this way, has not expressed a particular interest in engaging with the public service in that way, does not recognize that we actually are going to need more public servants than in previous years because we have more public services that will have to be delivered by the government as
Yes.
a lot of this revenue must be distributed. I believe that there's a report that they cut 1 in every 10 jobs in the public sector over the course of the last year or so. So that is the opposite of the way that the country will really have to be run. If you want to distribute these resources well, if you want to make use of these resources, you need competent public servants, and you need to have the appropriate level of staffing to do that. A simple example is we're talking about desperate need for night schools to retrain a huge amount of Guyanese to get them to be able to be fit for the new job market, the change job market. Well, how are these people going to be trained? We've got to hire people to train them. We've got to hire people to administer those types of things. We've got to pay teachers more if we're going to ask them to come in the evenings now and train people in math and English. These are all areas that will call for consumption, will call for higher pay, will call for adding jobs to the public service in order for us to effectively execute on the needs of the nation. Now, if you don't have a particular focus on the needs of the nation and you focus on other things, then you can understand why you're going to cut the public service, why you're going to reduce, not offer substantial raises. We've seen very, very limited raises in public servant salaries over the past couple of years, even with very high inflation and food inflation. So that, I think, is what's going on there. Their focus is not on addressing the needs of the nation, but rather on filling their own pockets. Well, I think it is on the one hand it is filling their own pockets, but I genuinely believe that there's a lot of there's an extreme level of incompetence. Some of the things that are happening are too obvious, too easy. They're missing obvious things, and as a result of that, I think that the level of incompetence is very severe.
Yes, and of course, incompetence is the outcome of agendas that are not developmental. There is a relationship between political and ethnic domination and underdevelopment. There is a relationship between trying to buy votes on the one hand and developing the country. If you're trying to buy votes, then you engage in the politics of fractism. And I want you to comment on that. After 2 years of running around the country and throwing a couple $1,000s here, going over there and throwing a couple $1,000s more, what has been the impact of that kind? I don't even want to call it an economic approach, because it is not, of that kind of nonsense. I call it that. What has been the impact, first of all, on the people, and second, on the economy as a whole?
Well, I'll give your viewers both a macro and a micro perspective on this. So the
Right.
macro perspective is that the focus on friends and family and corruption and so on has undermined the overall strength of the economy, the overall performance. Now, we heard an allegation from a certain man named Sue that he paid a larger bribe for a hydroelectric project, and that would be, of course, the Amalia project. Now, the reason that that is so important, and Guyanese need to really understand the implications if these allegations are true, is that what it means is that the reason that we didn't get cheap electricity all those years ago could very well be that bribes were being taken. And that in turn meant that we couldn't get the manufacturing jobs that we were trying to get. We couldn't get unemployment down and so on. And so, again, very obvious things we could not execute on them because of this focus on your friends. Because you'll recall that the vice president said, Sue is my friend, he gets all the support. Right. So, because of that kind of thinking and focus, it may very well have been that the literal reason that Guyana has not been able to develop is because of that style of governance, that style of thinking. So this is a very direct thing I'm saying. The reason you don't have lower electricity costs could very well be because a certain person who has a bald head and has been and wears glasses has been taking bribes this whole time. So that could very well be the reason that if these allegations are true, that's literally the reason the country hasn't developed. Now, that's the other thing. The other thing I would say then is that now on a micro level, focusing on friends and family and favorites, that's what we call it, friends, family, and favorites.
Yeah.
Is that seeing funds distributed to Gaisuko, funds distributed to fishermen and so on. And while, yes, we believe that, because we just talked about the 300,000 available, various people should, across the country, there should be assistance provided. Even with the fishermen, what I say is this. You got 150,000, but 300,000 was available. So where is the rest of your 300,000? Right? Where is it? They only give you half. So that's the first thing you have to ask them. The second thing I would say is, they had a program where they were giving you $40,000 for part-time work, right? $40,000 for part-time work. Now, what I found to be absolutely absurd about this, we have just spoken about the real need for education, for real need for people to go back and write subjects, real need for people to retool and re-educate themselves for the fresh modern economy. You mean to tell me that they couldn't figure out that you just can give people a $40,000 stipend to go back and study instead of having them twiddling the thumbs with these part-time jobs? It was transparently stupid. That is an example of something which is just stupid. I mean, I don't like to call people stupid. I'm not going to name names, but that's a policy which I think is so obvious. You could have just said we're going to create a training program for all of these people and we're going to give them a $40,000 stipend. Boom. First of all, you're now retraining people for the modern economy, for the oil and gas economy, giving them better opportunities. But second of all, you're able to get some cash into people's hands. So it's not just a handout, or, it's something which you will give them a brace while they develop and while they continue to progress. So obviously, what we're going to do, we've talked about student stipends. We're going to give students similar amounts for them to study because we see that it is obvious that what you should do is give people a stipend to help them through the years as they retrain and they get ready to enter the economy and earn higher wages. So, those are the types of policies that are so obvious that it makes me lose confidence in the policy making of the administration. The moment that I saw it, it took me 2 seconds to dismantle the policy. It should never be that easy, and it is indicative of a high degree of incompetence. Now, similarly with the cash grants, they could have tied these cash grants to a wide range of things. As an example, the Because We Care cash grant, it could easily have been said that in order for you to get a Because You Care cash grant, you have to have a certain level of attendance at schools. Now, you would immediately have solved your dropout problem. I mean, this is the type the fact that so many students are dropping out of school would immediately have been solved. Very obvious. We are going to implement those types of policies. If you're getting our various cash grants, your children should be attending school and so on. Very very simple things, but with a huge impact in terms of the benefits to the economy. And so, yes, I believe that people should get access to resources, especially to help them through this difficult time. But a lot of this is very easy for you to, if you take a second and you think about it, for you to come up with good policies that will serve the nation well. However, if you just focus on friends, family, and favorites, you're going to come up with a bunch of policies that are either transparently stupid or do not actually achieve the objectives that you want them to achieve. And that is what you're seeing time and time again. I mean, really, this is complicated and sophisticated things I'm telling you, or this is basic things. I don't have to delve into economics papers and so on to explain this. It's very like obvious.
Yeah,
But
yeah, and judging from the comments here on our program this evening, our people who are not trained economists and all those things, they get it. They get it. They get it because, as you said, they got to face the store. They got to face the markets. They got to face when the beef goes up to $700 and $800 per pound. They got to decide, in my family of five, can I afford 2 pounds of beef, 3 pounds of beef, or do I go back to 1 pound of beef? And then when you go to the green side, that's gone up to and so on. It's really a hell of a situation that we are. And as you have pointed out, we should not be in that situation because unlike other countries, similar countries, we have benefited from the war. If you're saying the war caused the cost of living to go up, we are benefiting from. So we have a clear and present cushion, and more than a cushion. We may have 2 or 3 cushions. This situation that's happening. Elson Low, young man here, he keeps saying we, which is a good sign. He is the economic advisor to the leader of the opposition, member of the People's National Congress, young economist that's really helping us to make sense of the economy around us. Elson, what's happening with sugar?
yeah. Well, sugar is another area that has been so thoroughly mismanaged that it really beggars belief. It's unbelievable. But I think what has happened is that the government has this cushion, as we mentioned, a cushion of oil, and so they've allowed the sugar situation to deteriorate, whether through lack of focus or something. But what has happened is that at the mid-year, in the mid-year report and around mid-year, sugar production was down, I think 56% versus what it was expected to versus the previous year. And I think it is down overall closer to 70%. Excuse me, closer to 70% based expectation increased production, but you actually saw a drop in production of 56 or something like that percent. Now, that therefore means there's a massive gap between expectations and reality. Because if you thought that sugar production was going to grow and the sugar production actually fell off a cliff like that, that's an unbelievable. I mean, there are very few businesses where you can have 70% perform 70% below what people expect you to perform at. That is ridiculous, and that's what's going on in sugar right now. It's been mismanaged to the point where I think sugar workers are afraid that whether or not the industry will survive. what we have said, and I've mentioned this before, is I personally believe that Gaisuku should be renamed as the Guyana Energy Corporation, or the Guyana Oil and Gas Training Corporation, or something. And what we should do is focus on retraining a lot of the Gaisuku workers to take up the oil and gas jobs that are popping up all over the country, and where we have a tremendous demand. So I think we really need to retrain a lot of those workers. Now, of course, those jobs are higher earning jobs, so we need to retrain workers to be able to benefit from higher earning jobs. At the same time, I think that Gaisuko needs to be reformed so that we can increase productivity, so that we don't need that kind of a workforce, and so that it can diversify and so on into areas that are profitable. And so I think really there's a side of the aisle that is happy to keep sugar workers there, pay them next to nothing, and get them a little dollar every now and then to cool them off. We are not talking about that. We're talking about getting some high paying wages. I mean, many people in the oil and gas industry are making $400,000 a month easily, easily. We're
Mhm.
trying to get people into some high paying jobs, get them to get some housing and assets and so on, because ultimately we're looking to move people's lives forward, not trap them in a system to kind of force them to vote for us. We are looking to move people's lives forward. So we've done some evaluation of Gaisuku. We're continuing to do some evaluation, but it's pretty clear the direction that Gaisuku needs to go, and that there's tremendous needs in the economy and other areas, and and that now is set against the backdrop of them underperforming their targets by nearly 70%.
Elson, let's get back to that World Bank update. Um, as a young man, I grew up in the politically in the 70s and the 80s, and it was a time when third world countries were very suspicious of these international organizations, the IMF and the World Bank and so forth. The structural adjustment that all our countries went through in the 80s and the 90s were as a result of the conditionalities of the IMF and the World Bank. So my generation is very, very suspicious of these organizations. Have they changed? And can we, as people in the developing world, see them as allies?
Well, what I would say is that I think that unfortunately, there was a big disconnect between the IMF and the World Bank and the countries that were on those types of structural adjustment programs. And whereas I think the IMF and World Bank had an idea of how they thought those countries could develop, I think that was not, and the policies that are required for that was not communicated well, and there was not the adequate support provided to countries to
Mhm.
help them to follow those paths. I think really the IMF and World Bank expected many countries with these reformed approaches to grow quite similar to China. I think that's what they were expecting, but none of the policies and the approaches and the research was put in place to support the countries to have that kind of industrial manufacturing oriented growth. So I think that has resulted in a great period of, as you say, of distrust, of tensions. Now, on the flip side, we've got an IMF and a World Bank that are looking closely at the poverty situation, looking closely at the oil boom. The IMF, of course, has cautioned the government to slow down a little bit in terms of their spending. The World Bank has brought up these poverty statistics not on accident. So I think they're very aware of many of the macro factors. But what I would say, and this is where I wouldn't rely too heavily on the IMF and the World Bank in some respects. Some areas, yes, their insight is good. Other areas, not so much, because there's a difference between a standard economic policy and a standard economic system, and an oil economy and an oil system, and there are different challenges that come from that. As an example, corruption is a much bigger problem on an oil and gas economy than it is on the most other types of economies. Why is this? It's because the revenues, the huge level of revenue, all the money is concentrated in the hands of the state. So that means now that the state now has access to monies from which to steal. That is not the case in different types of economies. It may be to a certain extent, but it's not the state the same way. So that's why you've seen countries like Equatorial Guinea, where they've got a 70% poverty rate, and they have the highest per capita GDP in Africa, as high as Spain and those types of things. So I think that means that we as a country must be wary of the risks that are specific to our type of economy, and therefore put emphasis on it, even where the IMF and World Bank may not emphasize these things as much as we would. They have a perspective which is useful in many areas, and they've offered advice which we've incorporated into our policies. But and I would say this as well: the IMF can't come out flatly and say, "Listen, you guys teething too much. You gotta stop." Right? They can't come out and say that. They have to navigate the politics of the situation. Even if they think that there's too much corruption and theft, they can't come out and say that. We know, as Guyanese have to recognize the massive levels of corruption that we've seen in our society's history and how these things need to be addressed. One thing that I would point your viewers to as something for them to ponder, and I think many of them are already making the connection. You'll recall that with Amalia Falls, when it first started out, the price doubled. I don't know if you recall that the price went through the
Yes.
roof. Now the gas Ashore project, from the time the gas Ashore project started to now, the price has doubled or more than doubled. It looks exactly the same as Amalia. It looks exactly the same. And so, what the leader of the opposition has called for, and I think quite rightly, is an updated feasibility study so that we know exactly what is going on with the gas Ashore project and the level of feasibility and what needs to be adjusted about the project. That, therefore, is something that I think the average Guyanese 100% understands, buys into, sees what's going on, and understand, and right away can say, listen, something is wrong. But is the IMF going to come out and say, it looks like something like people, it looks like there's a lot of theft in this country. It looks like there might be some more theft going on now. They can't come out and say that. So there are perspectives that they offer that are good. Research is good. The World Bank put out some poverty statistics, which I think have helped to wake people up to the situation. But we also need to recognize that they can only go so far in their comments and criticisms. And they're not living the Guyanese experience the way that we're living the Guyanese experience. And as a result of that, I think we have to take everything they say, with a little bit of a grain of salt.
A little bit with a grain of salt. Elson Low here, discussing the Guyanese economy tonight. And of course, when we have to walk through this economic situation in our country, if you're a practicing economist, your eyes open wide because, a lot of food there for research and study. But if you're also a Guyanese and a working class patriot, it's depressing. But the young man has been able to give us a dispassionate and, from what I'm seeing, a very intelligent um, uh, uh, outlook on the economy, answering questions, raising questions. And that's what we are about here. Elson, closing remarks?
Thank you. Well, what I would say is that, and this is where I think your viewers need to train their minds now. We all here in Guyana have to become aware of oil, understand oil, the way that we understood sugar, the way that we understood bauxite, the way that we understand rice. We got to understand oil. And the first thing that we need to be paying attention to is that in early December, there's going to be additional sanctions that kick in on Russia, which may cause a spike in the oil price. I've been warning about this all year. Why does this matter for you? If there's a spike in the oil price, what will happen is you're going to see prices go up right through the roof for food all over again. You're going to see high inflation. You're going to see cost of living go up. But also, you're going to see the government get even more revenue. And so we must renew our call for the government to redistribute, to ease the cost of living crisis, and to help the average Guyanese. And so I would urge your viewers to be vigilant over the course of the next couple of months as we see these things unfold. And for them more generally to be more vigilant when it comes to the oil price in the oil market, because that is going to have a huge impact on their life going forward, with an economy already completely dominated by oil and gas. So we have to be 100% aware of these things, keeping an eye out on these things, and always know at the back of our mind that this is affecting both our everyday lives in terms of cost of living and the government revenues. And so, whatever we do, we have to keep that in mind. So, I would urge your viewers, as the year winds down, to be alert and to continue to pressure the government to give people what it is that they really are entitled to, what it is that is theirs, so that they can navigate this cost of living crisis until things calm down.
Elson Low, young economist, laying it out for us. Thank you very much, my brother, for coming on and, as usual, lighting up the light, as we would say in the village. Good work, good job. And gosh, you've been off for too long, and we'll have to bring you back soon, because there are
Always
questions
happens to
here.
mind.
Right, there are questions here about the Auditor General's report and some other things that people are interested in. We'll get you back here sooner rather than later. Thank you much. Young man, they're really laying it out for us. Tomorrow night, we're going to be on earlier. So we're going to be on at 6 o'clock because I have another engagement at 7. So we're going to do an early edition of Politics 101 tomorrow. Look out, early, 6 o'clock tomorrow night. Until then, be good, be vigilant, and remember, as usual, what? We love you. We love you because you love us. We love Guyana because Guyana has done much for us. And we are not going to surrender Guyana to the gangsters. We are not going to surrender our homeland to the gangsters. Guyana belongs to all of us, regardless of race, color, creed, or class, or gender. Belongs to all of us. What we are fighting for is not supremacy. What we are fighting for is not domination. What we are fighting for is equality. Good night.